Puff pastry is a delicate, crispy pastry that is rich in fat, and an endless amount of baking goods depend on puff pastry. Now, puff pastry apparently consists of 980 layers of fat and pastry, but only butter puff pastry is the real deal, because most of us actually never tasted real butter puff pastry. Let's be honest, 99% of the time you get margarine puff pastry, and that tastes a bit like plastic. It's horrible. And in this video, I show you how you can make butter puff pastry, which is actually really easy to do. Plus, I will teach you chemistry and all the techniques and every tip and trick that you need to know to succeed with puff pastry at home. Now, my name is Walter Trapp. I used to manage and run some of Europe's best restaurants, and today I run my own cooking school. So the first thing is we need to soften the butter. So the butter is around sort of 15 degrees. I need to sort of squeeze it a bit, make it elastic. It's a bit like a Play-Doh, because we're gonna fold the pastry around that lump of butter. So if the butter is too hard and you can't roll it, it will tear your dough later on. I'll tell you more about that later on. And then once it's nice and soft, push it in sort of into the shape of a brick, put it in the fridge while we make the dough. So the dough, we're gonna now basically use some flour, and I wanna show you what's a cup. That's not a cup, okay? So it needs to be completely flat. A lot of people I see, they really get that wrong. So a cup is when it's filled to the brim, like you see me doing here. And that's it. So you do have a recipe in the link below. Check also out my online courses to learn much more about cooking. And yes, the recipe in the link below, so just have a look at that. Okay, so next thing is what we're gonna do is we're gonna add some salt, and then we're gonna add some melted butter, and then I also add some vinegar. The vinegar is extremely important. It balances out the flavor, you know, it gives it slightly an acidic note. Plus it also stops the dough from oxidizing, which means the dough will not get gray if you store it for like 3 or 4 days in the fridge. After that, you have to freeze it down. Now, when you mix water with flour, the water swells the starch particle. That eventually leads to gluten development when enzymes get activated. Water activates gluten and gliadin. Both are also proteins. Now, when they get moved and kneaded, the flour starts to develop a net of gluten or gluten strains. You keep kneading it, and the gluten links up and creates stronger and stretchier bonds. Gliadin proteins make the dough flow, they give it strength, and they make the dough really elastic and bouncy. Plus, a protein cutting enzyme called proteases begins cutting strands of gluten into smaller pieces and smaller pieces that make separate and smaller connections, tightening the dough even more. So as you knead, the protein chains increase and become into what is known the gluten network or gluten webbing. Now, during resting, the gluten network relaxes and readjusts its strengths. Then when you roll it out, the gluten strengths tighten again and reorganize once again, okay? So you need to rest the dough again after folding, otherwise it will bounce back when you try to roll it out, especially if you try to roll it out in a different direction. Hence, resting it between each tour is needed, so the dough rolls out easy without too much force. In case of butter puff pastry, you don't have to sort of super stress yourself of too much gluten development at the beginning, as you will roll and re-roll and actually activate those enzymes for another 5 times. But what you need to do, you need to make sure that you knead it really well so that the dough is really well combined and it starts to be really bouncy, not sticky anymore. Okay, then you need to get the dough into a really nice shape, so you're going to build a bit of structure on the outside of the dough. Something I would do for bread baking as well, but that helps later on with the rolling. So just get a nice roll, push it together. My dough is a bit harder. I'll tell you more next week when I show you how to make a beef Wellington, why I made my dough a little bit harder for that, so stay tuned for that. So push it in, push it together on the bottom, and then it needs to rest so that the gluten can relax. And you do that in the fridge because the butter and the dough should have the same temperature. That helps enormously. So what are the challenges with this dough? Butter that is too cold and too hard, that would tear the dough. butter that is too soft and could be absorbed or squeezed out between the dough sheets on the sides. Now rolling the dough with too much force where the butter could be pushed into the dough with no more butter and pastry layers being left, and then it couldn't rise anymore, and it basically would just become a really fancy pie crust. And to avoid all of that, you need to have an ideal working temperature, which is around 15 to 17 degrees Celsius, to assure that the butter is flexible but still cold enough so it does not integrate into the dough. So you maintain those distinctive layers of butter and dough, otherwise all those flaky layers cannot develop. So then I take it out of the fridge, and all we basically want to do is now fold the pastry around the fat and give it fold it, roll it, fold it, roll it, and so that create 980 layers or less. So it just basically take the pastry, you make a cross on the top, you cut it down halfway, okay, halfway down, make a cross, cut down the other side, and that is your pastry now. And in that, we're gonna now roll it out, we're gonna shape four, like think about the 4-leaf clover, and then we're just gonna put the butter in it. So the most important thing here is now that you roll out the sides, okay, but you leave a sort of a little portal in the center, because when you fold over the pastry, it should have the same thickness on the bottom as it will have on the top. If you roll it out in the center too, you know what's going to happen is you're going to have an uneven thick layer of pastry on the bottom, so it needs to be equal. So can you see what I do here now? I leave the center really high, I really push the leaves out, and I need to roll them out enough that I can completely fold them over the pastry, which I'll show you now in a second, okay? And then butter goes on. You fold over the ears, and so now basically having 3 layers. Fold it, get more layers, and so on, and so on, and so on. Here we go. It looks absolutely amazing. So puff pastry, we said before about the vinegar, it stops oxidization. It doesn't last that long in the fridge. You can get a bit of gray, so, but it freezes really well. So just put it in the freezer and freeze it for a few months. Just make sure you have it tight. Now when you bake puff pastry, you should end up with the fluffiest, crispiest dough pillars that you know, or that we know in cooking. Today we do 5 single tours to keep it simple, and we should end up with lots of layers, lots and lots of layers. Okay, I know I'm not that good at math, and basically it's lots of layers. That's all I can guarantee, okay? That's actually 729. I looked it up. So puff pastry in France is called millefeuille, meaning 1,000 leaves. But they're actually not that many. I mean, that's so typically French, always exaggerating when it comes to size and layers, don't they? So next thing is, don't roll it when you start it. You need to pat it. You always need to think about the layer or the brick of butter inside. So I want to flatten the butter, okay? So if I would push that and roll it, I would get the butter brick inside uneven. I want to keep that butter brick really even. And then when you roll it, you roll from the inside outwards, not from the outside, because then you start pushing the dough on the edges. Keep folding it over. Always make sure that you have enough flour there. You don't want it to stick. If you don't have flour underneath, the dough will not slip. So you need to make sure you have always a good layer of flour. Then you roll it thinner and thinner and thinner, okay? So roll it for approximately like 1 centimeter thick for the first lot. Fold it, that's a singular tour, into the plastic bag and back into the fridge, where you rest it now for 25 to 30 minutes. Now I remember when I was back in England, you used to use the time between the tours to sort of pour yourself a cup of tea and look out the window and talk about the weather. You know, that usually takes half an hour or so. Just the right time for the next fold, and when the next tour then comes along, chances are that the weather has changed again, and yeah, and then you have more stuff to talk about. I mean, fascinating if you ask me, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the video, okay? Okay, so let's take it out of the fridge and give it a second tour. If you come across books, there might be double tours, singular tours. I'm just gonna do 5 singular tours to keep things really simple. So, flour, gluten is relaxed. Again, start batting it before you roll it. Then you roll it, and always do that from the center outwards. So here we go. Turn it over in case you have the butter breaking through somewhere. Don't stress. I'm going to show you how to fix that. So in case you have a bit of butter oozing out like I have here, you just go there and you rub lots and lots of flour on it, and that will create another layer of pastry, and then you just brushed it off. The brushing is extremely important because you don't want to have too much flour between the dough layers, because if you roll it with a lot of flour between the dough layers may slip. So it's important to always brush the pastry clean before you put it back in the bag, and then put it back into the fridge, rest it for another half an hour, get it out again. So now we give it 2 tours. Next thing we give it a number 2 and number 3, and every time you do it, you will find it's actually getting easier and easier because the gluten gets more developed and the dough becomes really silken. And just keep folding it, always turn it, always have plenty of flour. I always like, when I make puff pastry, I set half a day aside and I make like 4 or 5 blocks like that, and I keep working through it, and now it's basically enough puff pastry for a whole year. So keep it cleaning it by brushing all the flour off so the dough cannot slip later on. Back in the bag next to her. I mean, it's getting a bit boring now, but you get the idea. So you could literally think like in 3 hours I could easily make 4 or 5 blocks like that. Wrap it really well in cloud wrap and avoid freezer burn, and it literally lasts you for months and years. Okay, so that's our next tour, and the dough is super flexible by now. Into the fridge, and then I'm going to show you in a minute how it looks inside. So I give you now 5 tours. Okay, so now cut it in half and you actually can see the layers of butter and pastry, and that is what you want. And the next thing I do now is to roll it out, because there's quite a lot you need to understand when you cut pastry, puff pastry, and the same thing would apply for croissant doughs, is that you cannot just cut it as it is, because the edges now all stick together. Okay, so the edges actually have probably tightened up a bit and they stick together, and if you don't cut it, and you need to cut it and not drag it, so the knife or the blade you use, you have to make it moist. So I dip my knife into water and then I cut it, I don't drag it, so that I clean up the sides and I expose the layers of butter and pastry, and when I bake it later on, it will perfectly rise. So next thing you do is you just brush it with some egg, and then you can make some markings into it if you want to. Just use a fork and make some ribbons. I mean, you can of course have a special pastry comb, and that does that much better. But if you don't have one, you just use a fork like I do here. So that's it. And then again, dip your knife into water, cut it. So the next thing is it goes into a tray, and before you bake it, you need to put the pastry or the puff pastry into the freezer for half an hour to make sure it's really cold, because through that it will rise better. So half an hour in the freezer. Now my favorite part where it all starts to make sense, chemistry. So you basically create a stack of pastry sheets lined with butter sheets. Now when the puff pastry gets baked and the water captured in those dough layers basically becomes steam, but that steam cannot escape through the layers of fat that you created. So the only thing the steam can do is push up the fat layers, you know? Now multiply that by a few hundred times and you suddenly have an endless amount of pastry and fat layers. The layers in baking are called feuilletage, and you need to make sure when you cook your puff pastry that you cook it long enough so that all the water from inside has evacuated from the pastry, and the pastry gets filled with hot air where it becomes really crispy and really fragile. If you bake it too little and there's still water trapped inside the dough, it will not be crispy, It will be really doughy and even collapse when you take it out of the oven. Okay, recipes in the link below. Check out my online courses, and doesn't that puff pastry look amazing?